package that is being called for. We have on the line Thebe Mabanga, contributing editor, Inside Politics. And Thebe, welcome to our program. Firstly, tell us about how do you differentiate between calling for a stimulus during this time when government actually has disaster management and coming up with interventions to fight or rather combat this crisis?
Good afternoon. Yes, look, you do need to make a distinction. The first set of measures, as we've said in our story, you first cushion the blow of the immediate crisis. But the stimulus package that is required, it's beyond the coronavirus crisis. It's to put the economy on a growth footing for the next decade or so. That is the stimulus package which was needed even before the coronavirus hit. Now that the virus has struck, all that it does just heightens the agency with which you need the stimulus. So you do distinguish between the immediate measures, but also what you need to do for the long term.
So how long can government sustain this? Because one would get an understanding of, out of the interpretation of an intervention is that if you can't really go beyond the 21 days or the impact thereof, say, a period of 3 months, how will this really set the government off, and will the business be able to carry on its own?
Look, no, it won't. As it is, I mean, the manufacturing sector alone, there's already estimates that recovery will take anything from 6 months to possibly longer. The longer the shutdown lasts, the more damage it will obviously do. So the hope, obviously, is that we don't go beyond the 21 days. But again, that's an immediate problem. So if you look now in Asia, you're already having signs of people returning to work. China is starting to lift restrictions in places like Hubei. So just like where the wave first struck, you hope this normalization wave will follow a similar pattern. So the second wave of countries to be struck, except for Europe, unfortunately. Maybe the U.S. returns to a bit of normality. So you hope that you don't go, in terms of the shutdown, you don't go beyond the 21 days. In other words, you hope we flatten the curve, we contain the infections. So, but that, again, is just the immediate problem. The question then after that becomes, how long after that does the economy take to recover in full? So the problem we've had is that if you look at, say, the financial crisis in 2008, we tend to lag even middle-income peer countries in terms of the time it takes for our growth and job creation to recover. And that's the mode we must not be stuck in. We cannot 3-5 years from now still be pointing to the coronavirus of 2020 has caused that slow growth. That is why you need to put in place, say, second half of the year, before the year is out, you definitely need to start putting in the stimulus measures to stimulate the economy.
All right, so from now on, looking at how South Africa will be coming out of a double whammy of COVID-19 as well as a subdued economy. Surely, if one were to break even and coming out of a recession, it means that when you have to come out of the zero-based level of the economy going sideways to go now to the 0%, 0.8, and then exactly 1% growth is going to take a long time.
Look, it depends how you count these numbers. So at the moment, the Reserve Bank says the economy will shrink by 0.2%. Now, I think they are being very optimistic, and they know it as well. Citibank says the economy will shrink by 0.4%. I think that, too, is still being optimistic. So if you have an economy that shrinks by, say, between 0.5% to 1%, that's an erosion of between 25 to 50 billion worth of value. So that's an order of numbers of what you need to replace this growth. Now, one of the sources that can or should be used, and people tend to be afraid of this, is the debt. So we know from the 2020 budget that the debt to GDP ratio is now going to balloon in some people's eyes from 59% to 71% in 3 years, right? But if you look at that 71% projection, if you add 5 percentage points to that 71% projection to take your debt to GDP ratio, say, to just below 80%, that creates a room for borrowing for about 250 billion rands. That's additional. You can then put that into infrastructure spending, into consumption stimulus measures, improving your logistics, the kind of stimulus that people like Duma Kula keep calling for. You can create that extra room of 250 billion rands purely by raising your debt to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points. Yes, that will incur a higher debt servicing cost, but if you use it wisely, the growth you generate will enable you to compatible with bad debt. The thing about debt is that if you announce how high you intend it to be and show how you intend to manage it over the next decade, you should not have, rating agencies and the world at large should be able to trust your debt. And that is where we seem to lack the courage to do. So, 5 percentage point increase in the debt-to-GDP ratio can yield 250 billion rands, which can immediately be used to stimulate the economy.
Right. So now there has been a problem with the South African Revenue Service being unable to collect what it's supposed to. With a shortfall of about 50 billion rand. And again, we have to distinguish the way forward now. As we're talking about intervention to cushion. But what about a strategic bounce? Out of the double whammy that I've been talking about, you've also added ratings agencies downgrading South Africa.
Look, rating agencies should be the least of our worries at the moment. I think they can see the world is in an abnormal space. The issue we have to concern ourselves about is the structure of our economy. How do we restructure this economy to make it more resilient to shocks? How do we restructure this economy to make it more favorable to global growth when the growth returns? And how do we restructure this economy, of course, to make it work for a higher proportion of the population? At the moment, we have a high proportion that's excluded, that's the poor and unemployed. So we need to be thinking about how we restructure the economy to those ends, to take advantage of global growth, to work for a higher proportion of the South African population, and to grow through more levers like your agricultural exports, manufactured good exports, the kind of areas that we seem to have been underperforming. That should be our primary concern, and that is where any stimulus measure should be directed towards.
All right. Thebe Mabanga, thank you very much for your time. He's a contributing editor of Inside Politics. And let's try and get Mr. Raiz